It is really kind of special to be here tonight, so thank you very much for inviting me. Anthony, and thanks very much for coming on a very chilly night. Although being from the northeast of the United States, it's actually not really all that cold. That's okay, come on in. The more the merrier. Welcome aboard. Just out of curiosity, how many of you are actually quilters? Far out, okay. So, welcome. I'm going to go off script for just a second and about how I got to a spot where, as a 57-year-old white American male, I can be up here talking about Australian quilts. Prior to moving to Australia, I was in Central Texas for 4 years as the executive director of a regional arts council. We had about 100 affiliate groups within that, one of which was one of Texas's smallest quilting bees called the Brazos Bluebonnet Quilt Guild, and smallest at only 250 active members. So that gives you an idea of the size of quilt bees in the United States, particularly Texas. And the first few months I was there, one of the women pulled me aside and asked me what I knew about American quilts. Being my family's been in the United States for a really long time. My mother's from the South. I kind of knew enough about quilting to be dangerous. And so they pulled me under their wing and they said, okay, we are going to teach you everything we know about quilts in the next couple of years. And they proceeded to educate me about some of the basics, hand stitching versus machine stitching versus classic quilts, ancient quilts, modern quilts, art quilts, slave quilts, southern quilts, northern quilts. And by the time I left there 4+ years later, I knew more about quilting than I thought I would ever learn. And then I come to Australia and fall into a National Wool Museum, which happens to have a large collection of quilts and waggas. And everyone said, great, you are now our expert on quilts and waggas. Learn everything you can. So 10 years into my role there, I have acquired enough knowledge about waggas to be dangerous. So thank you for coming along and listening. So on that note, okay, we are going to talk a little bit tonight about the very Australian art and cultural tradition, waggas, or as you said, the Bushman's blanket. We're also going to talk a little bit about the National Wool Museum and our collection and the role that we have within that world, textiles, quilts, and blankets, and waggas. Pardon me. And along the way, we're going to talk a lot tonight about a couple of concepts, about necessity, about the make do, use up, or do without, and kind of the spirit of overcoming adversity. But first, I'm going to ask us all to take a little bit of a step backwards. And pardon me if I read directly, because I'd rather do that than miss a point. For over 60,000 years, humans have been joining together two pieces of something to make something else. Something bigger, something stronger, something more safe, something warmer, or even something just more beautiful. We know this for a fact because the oldest needle that's ever been found anywhere in the world is just over 60,000 years old. It was found in a cave in South Africa. The next oldest is about 52,000 years old, and that was found in a cave in Siberia. So we know from empirical fact, that humans have been doing that for 60,000 years. We know through our work and our relationship with the world's oldest living culture here in Australia that they speak to this as well, 60,000-year tradition of textile making. And nowhere is this more evident than in the quilting tradition. A textile of 2 or more layers that are put together and sewn together and stitched through all thicknesses. Quilting was developed for warmth, stability, safety, and durability. Over the millennia, it has grown beyond the humble padded something or other and morphed and adapted and embedded traditions, formed its own identity, and suited as a union of different ethnic and cultural traditions. I'd like to share with you now a little video that we have made that attempts to explain this all to you in just 4 minutes.
The History of Quilting in 4 minutes. Chapter 1, A Stitch Somewhere in Time. The history of quilts begins with the expression, 2 pelts are better than 1, and 3 are even better still. The origin of quilting is unclear. However, we do know the first needle is some 60,000 years old. And the earliest known quilted garment? That's depicted on a carved ivory figure of an Egyptian pharaoh. about 3400 BCE. Safe to say, the practice of layering, stitching, and embellishing started somewhere in between. Chapter 2. Quilts are like pancakes. Every culture has one. Pick a continent, any continent. Chances are you'll find something quilted. From Australian possum skin cloaks to Aztec Ichkawippili armor, Hawaiian kappa-inspired quilts to auspicious Tibetan banners or Zimbabwean wea story cloths. Nearly each and every society has embraced and adopted quilting to fit their own cultural needs and tastes. Chapter 3. Quilting goes west. Huzzah! Crusaders brought quilting to Europe from the Middle East sometime in the 11th century, when knights wore unpronounceable quilted things under their armor for comfort and safety, and over their armor for comfort and safety, of, those delicate steel plates. Soon warm, comfy quilted armor inspired warm, comfy quilted bed covers, and so the quilt moved from one battlefield onto another. Chapter 4. The Golden Age. Viva la Industrial Revolución. In the 19th century, quilt making flourished, along with the middle class and easy access commercial goods, not to mention the sewing machine. Quilts became stories crafted in cloth, a crazy, puffed, patriotic patchwork of samplers, signatures, and memorials, fit for friendship, trading, or to just throw on your lap. Chapter 5. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall inherit the quilt. Legend tells of a woman's winter work, the patchwork square, a patterned square of fabric that forms the top of a quilt, with a cryptic encyclopedia of fanciful names to baffle even the best codebreakers. Bear paw, churn dash, periwinkle, flying geese, prairie queen, nine patch, and shoe fly. Meanwhile, piecing together these squares at Quilting Bee's elevated teamwork to an entirely new level. Chapter 6. Quilts for art's sake. Another revolution rocked the art and handcraft worlds when painters, printers, and sculptors turned to quilts as expressions of abstract art, and thus the art quilt was born. Soon, fine art collectors and museums embraced this collision of traditional technique and modern design form. The humble went highbrow. Chapter 7. It's fair dinkum Aussie, mate. Born out of necessity and the make-do Australian spirit, the Wagga was the bushman's blanket. Most likely named after Wagga Wagga, a place of wheat production and abundant old jute sacks. The traditional bushman's Wagga, made by pioneering men who lived a rough outback life droving and shearing, evolved as women replaced the very warm but very rough jute sacks with calico flour bags, fabric swatches, and bits of old clothes. And on that day, the domestic Wagga came home. Textile making is a practice spanning more than 60,000 years, from traditional techniques to cutting-edge technologies. Meanwhile, today, across the globe, eco-conscious makers are embracing the make do, use up, or do without spirit. Only nowadays, we call it upcycling. So there you have it, folks. Equal parts history, handcraft, art, storytelling, and good old-fashioned utilitarian usefulness. Quilts. The lost art that was never really lost.
There we go. Okay, there we go. Okay, welcome back. So, hopefully you enjoyed that. So quilting is indeed found all over the world, especially the repurposing of little bits of scraps of fabric and little bits of textile, remnants and discards, and there is evidence of this globally. Crazy quilts, military uniform or prisoner of war quilts, story quilts, canta quilts, and so forth and so on. Quilting, this is because sewing and quilting is a union rather than a separation. It is a bringing together of traditions, symbols, and it is used to convey certain themes of self-expression, unite opposite values, form close bonds among makers and kin, and here I refuse to say between women. A lot of people say that quilting is a woman's thing, and it is not. It is very much, throughout time and space, quilting is not just women's business, it is everybody's business. Quilts are heritage, their history, their family, their comfort, their love, their commitment. They are utility, they are design, fashion, thrift, and also very personal. Again, stories of country and kin. Pardon me. The piecing together of little bits and scraps is a make-do, use-up, and do-without tradition found throughout the world, especially in the pre-fast fashion, pre-use-up, consume, and move-on era. The Japanese, who have, or at least apparently have, an aesthetic for just about everything, call this yoshigiri. Yoshigiri is the practice of piecing together scraps of cloth to make clothing, screens, and other household items. Yoshigiri literally means to collect or to gather or to piece together. This is a cultural artistic tradition born from the need to extend the life of fabric, which has for centuries been a sacred resource. I like to point out at times like this that despite the fact that she owned half of France, Eleanor of Aquitaine, when the accounting of her wealth was given, the number 2 thing under owning half of France in her wealth was the vast quantity of fabric and textiles that she had. So that gives you an idea of the value of cloth and textiles over the years. That it was more than just a thing, it was a commodity and it was currency in many places. So this make do, use up, or do without philosophy resonates within the Buddhist teachings about interconnectedness of all things. And what a better allegory there is for interconnection than things like quilts, and particularly Waggas. When you take all of these little different things, bits of things, and you put them together into something different. And the interconnectedness of that is really something that I find quite fascinating. In India and Bangladesh and many parts of Southeast or South Central Asia, the kanta blankets are a 500 to 600 year old tradition where discarded cloth scraps are sewn together with a simple running stitch, transforming the discarded into something useful and possessive. Now this is far from trend setting. It is something that is found all over the place, but it is a really good example of constructed necessity and practical aspirations. Yet over time, like so many other traditions like the Wagga, like any other yoshigiri, any of these, kantas have developed as a generational artistry, a craft that imparts story, desire, love, and of course, resourcefulness. And today they are elaborate makings given as wedding gifts, birth gifts, and intergenerational gifts. Heather Cameron, who is a Vancouver textile, minimal consumption and maximum creation artist, speaks of being, quote, drawn to the abject, the discarded, and the idea of restoration and redemption. In her writings, she talks about the making of something out of nothing. And in a piece that she did about the truly legendary quilts that the women of Gee's Bend, Alabama do. Has anybody heard of these quilts? Yeah, they're really, it is quite an extraordinary art form and social art form. She describes how they are living below the poverty level in an isolated African-American hamlet, yet these women craft scraps into ornate abstract quilts. Necessity often opens a portal from which unbounded and organic fresh designs emerge. The necessity of make do, use up, or do without. So, what does this make do, use up, or do without look like in Australia? Well, for the world's oldest living culture, conversations that I've had with the Wadawurrung and other traditional owners and First Peoples, there is a deep textile tradition long before sheep, cotton, and quilts. It is some 60,000 years deep. Weaving and stitching is part of their textile tradition, whether it be pandanus, bark, or animal skin, often in layers stitched together or otherwise mounted together, utilitarian objects, body coverings, housewares, and ceremonial garments. Perhaps the most recognizable, especially in Victoria and Tasmania, of all of these would be the possum skin cloak. Post-colonial brings yet another tradition, the Wagga, the Australian tradition of making do, using up and doing without and recycling materials. So, what is a Wagga? I think I'd probably be preaching to the choir if I tried to teach all of you what a Wagga is, but indulge me as I go through the definition of it, because there may be somebody here who doesn't know, or maybe I just want to reiterate what we as a cultural institution call a Wagga. Born out of necessity, the Wagga is a particular kind of utilitarian quilt. It is quintessentially Australian craft, made by both men and women, and epitomizes this tradition of making do and overcoming adversity. Over the years, there have been many definitions of what a true Wagga recipe is. That I'm not going to, I won't get into that argument, but there are many definitions of what a true Wagga is. Hardcore purists might say that true Waggas were born of the bush, made only by men, drovers and shearers, out of pure need and necessity for survival. These consisted of multiple layers of jute or burlap sewn together. Yet traditionally, Waggas have also included calico sacks, recycled clothes, fabric scraps, old blankets, and or various bits of found, reused, repurposed textiles, and many materials from jute to cotton to wool, fur, and even paper. Waggas are made from the recycled materials that were available to people at the time. They were made for travelers. This might have been, for travelers on the land, this might have been flour or wheat sacks. For families, it might have been old clothing stitched together. So, why are they called Waggas? I would think, does everybody here know why they are called Waggas? No? All right, well, good. So why are they called Waggas? That's not really fully universally agreed upon yet, but it is generally acknowledged that their name is taken from the town of Wagga Wagga in New South Wales. And on a side note here, I would like to mention that Wagga Wagga is on Wurundjeri country, and for many years, the Wagga was thought to mean crow. So Wagga Wagga was thought to mean a place of many crows. And this is a translation from what they thought was the Wurundjeri language. In 2019, crow was dropped, and the city and community adopted a corrected Wurundjeri meaning as a place of dancing and celebrations. So I think that that's really something we're talking about this Australian tradition, and we're talking about a place that is named the place of dancing and celebration. I don't know about you, but I would really kind of like to live in a town called Dancing and Celebration. And not that Geelong isn't a town of dancing and celebration, but it's kind of different. So, in the latter half of the 1800s, Wagga Wagga was a crossroad of commerce, travel, and an active stock route, and a center of wheat, wool, and meat. It is believed that this is where the Wagga quilt tradition was born, as gangs of shearers and drovers came through, using old wool packs for sleeping and keeping warm. The name perhaps comes from the Wagga lily flour sacks made by the Murrumbidgee Cooperative, and I'm going to go back up to that slide, made by the Murrumbidgee Cooperative Flour Mill. The mill opened in 1890, and within a decade, the mill could store over 75,000 sacks on site. This would be primarily sacks of wheat. Unsubstantiated myth suggests that damaged or discarded sacks were left out back and piled high, and they were given out free to anyone who could use them for any kind of purpose whatsoever. And it is thought that this is possibly where the Wagga tradition, or the name of Wagga for the tradition, comes from. Perhaps it is also why the Wagga quilt is also sometimes called the Murrumbidgee blanket, or the Wagga rug, or the Wagga quilt, or the Woga, or the Bushman's blanket, or the bush rug, or the bush quilt, or the Bluey, or the Bluey blanket, or the Sydney blanket, or just the Murrumbidgee rug. It's a lot of names. So, Wagga Lily Flour Mill. All right, there we go. Through the failures of the 1880s property boom and the 1890s depression, which was probably Australia's worst economic depression. This led many people to look at thrifty ways of getting by, and the Wagga emerged and became a type of quilt making tradition that continues in Australia till today. The earliest known Waggas were made in the 1890s by outback men, shearers and drovers, the traditional bushman's Wagga of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. These started as the most basic Wagga, made of wool bales, corn or wheat sacks sewn together in layers. Later examples show sacks and bales that had been unconstructed or unstitched and opened up, with a cloth or calico bag backing, perhaps a blanket filling and cloth top, and then restitched together. In Henry Lawson's 1889 short story, The Darling River, he tells of an itinerant worker traveling by boat on the Darling. And I'll read a part of it here. You can read along if you wish. We slept or tried to sleep that night on the ridge of 2 wool bales laid with the narrow sides up, having been obligated to get ashore and fight 6 rounds with a shearer for the privilege of roosting there. The live cinders from the firebox went up the chimney all night and fell in showers on deck. Every now and again a spark would burn through the Wagga rug of a sleeping shearer, and he'd wake suddenly and get up and curse. And there's a bit more on, this goes on and on a bit more. In other stories, Lawson described children sleeping in cots made from old gin crates and sleeping beneath small Waggas. I was relaying this today to a member of my staff, and I felt like saying, I still kind of sleep in old gin crates. What are you talking about? But it was suggested that I shouldn't say that, but I just have. So there you go. In 1906, a correspondent to the Bulletin detailed a Wagga recipe, and I love how they call it a Wagga recipe. Detailed the Wagga recipe. And I won't read this whole thing, but the essence of it is that the only genuine Wagga rug is to take 3 wheat or corn sacks and sew them together with a packing needle and twine, side to side. Nothing more is needed. Many years later, the Western Herald in Burke, New South Wales, in its comprehensive list of shearing terms, noted that the Wagga was simply a covering made from 3 wheat bags stitched together. More recently, Kate Grenville's Orange Prize-winning novel, The Idea of Perfection, which is, to my recollection, a story of a small town of Karakaruk, I believe is how it's pronounced, and seemingly 2 people who were impossible to get along with each other and were fated not to fall in love, but did fall in love. She spoke in long passages about the uneven stuffings and the different colorations of Waggas, including a fairly lengthy passage about the weight and the light, dark patterns of the bush quilt and of old dresses backed with calico bags and the big red flower and the Wagga lily on the back. She went on to talk about, in one passage, I'll let you read the passage. So the Wagga has been in the Australian vernacular both in speech and socially and in practice pretty consistently since about 1900. As the wild Waggas of the 1890s became domesticated, other blankets and middle layers were added, perhaps with calico or cretonne, which is, does everybody know what cretonne is? It's a heavy kind of commercial fabric, cotton or a linen mix that was popular in sacking and commercial bags and things like that. Calico or cretonne was used on top. After the Great War and into the Depression, patterned tops started to be made using tailor's samples and cloth swatches and suit scraps with soft flour bags as the backing, and clothing or jute moved to the middle layer. Many examples of these can be found, and they still include fabric pattern numbers. There's a couple of quilts, particularly in the Powerhouse Museum, that you can see from the tailor's samples that each pattern of fabric might have a number on it, number 1, number 2, or might have a name on it. And they left, whoever made that particular Wagga, left the little names on it, so each square actually has the name of that different pattern on it, or the number that pattern is, which I think is really quite charming on that. On the onset of the 1930s and the Depression, the Wagga emerged as a necessity in regional Australia. As one writer in the Queenslander newspaper declared, the Wagga rugs are well known in most parts of Australia and an essential for everyday life. Waggas were not just something that you could simply buy. You couldn't just go out and get them anywhere in any shop. They were handmade by inventive and thrifty people, and because of this, they were deeply personal and deeply individual. There's a story of an English migrant in 1927 who learnt this the hard way. While traveling by boat to Australia, he was told by another passenger that a Wagga was the most important thing he needed in his bush travels. So, dutifully, during his first week in Melbourne, he traipsed from shop to shop, asking where he could buy one of these Waggas. He later learned that a Wagga is something that you have to make yourself. Around that time, the domestic Wagga became a common feature in many homes. Waggas that survive in collections such as those at the National Wool Museum reveal not only how families had to make do, but they also reveal the very personal stories. This child's quilt cover from 1929, which is part of our collection, was made by Jean Hepner's grandmother from used woolen garments at the onset of the Depression. The garments were hand-stitched to an old woolen blanket. The quilt was used by at least 5 of the 7 children in the family. It had assorted covers that were replaced when needed, and in later years, it was also used by Hepner's grandchildren. Excuse me for 1 second. In 1931, the Bathurst Relief Society put out a number of advertisements in the National Advocate, quote, appealing to residents who have sacks suitable for making Wagga blankets for the distressed Bathurst community. Through the Depression of the 1930s and the war efforts of the 1940s, the Wagga continued to be used around Australia. As late as 1951, Sydney and Melbourne prepared for winter power failures, retail stores sold out of blankets and sheets, and the Wagga returned again to warm the nation. Newspapers around Australia reported, quote, some people are going back to the old ways, the Wagga ways, and creating Wagga blankets. Hessian fluffed out to make it softer and enclosed between sheets of printed material. For those of you who are textile artists, can someone explain to me how you can fluff out Hessian? Because it is probably the least fluffy material in the world, so I love the fact that it is described as being fluffed out. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. As late as in 1951, New Idea, a magazine widely read by Australian homes, reported on the value of Waggas. So it's interesting that it was kind of touted as a social endeavor, almost like war efforts, socks in the war efforts and things like that. There's, if you needed to, articles in journals and in department stores on how to create a Wagga for yourself. So it was interesting how that's kind of just played such an integral part in the community. Another Wagga in the National Wool Museum collection is this coverlet made by Renee Densham for Chris Nayland when he was born in 1953. It was created from scraps of woolen fabric and from clothing used by the family. It was used in Chris's cot or pram when he was an infant. Lois Densham, who donated the quilt to the museum, remembered the dark green fabric coming from a jacket that she once wore, and the blue tartan pieces, which you can see just a little bit at the bottom corner and then up in the top corner there. She remembers this being a skirt that she wore and that Renee, her mother, wore. She also remembered her mother being, quote, a better piano player than a cook or a sewer. But according to her, the quilt was made in the tradition of making do or using up from a family that knew how. Beyond the 50s, the Wagga quilt seems to kind of fall out of favor in fashion. It is discarded. It is relegated to camping trips, pet beds, and rabbit hutches. It is seen by many as a vestige of a leaner time. And it was a sign of better times and growing social affluence. Some were preserved, memories for family and security, and the patterns of lives in multiple generations. But by many, it was seen as kind of a vestige of a less affluent time. So a lot of people discarded them, which is part of the reason why they're pretty rare now, particularly the really early ones. So today, the upcycling of materials for use in quilt making, we feel, is really an ongoing tradition. Pardon me. I thought I'd be able to get through this without drinking too much water, but so today, eco-conscious makers embrace the make, do, use up aesthetic as a lifestyle choice. This is in order to reduce waste, protect the environment, and contemporary Waggas reflect this quilting tradition and have become accepted as an art form. And we'll talk a little bit about the two Waggas that we have here today because they are contemporary. The one with the chicken bags may look old, but it's actually 2009. And the other one, 2019, and we'll talk a little bit about them in a minute. Recent explorations by quilters have revived the Wagga tradition. On the right-hand side, Barbara Meller's By Wagga Design 2017, sorry, not 2019, which received the Expressions Wool Quilt Prize in 2019, is an example of the Wagga tradition living on in quilting circles. Meller sourced fabrics from a variety of places, some from her personal collection while others were given to her. She purchased a woolen three-piece suit from a local op shop and incorporated it into the design. Another notable feature of the quilt is the patched label Parkside. This was cut from a blanket that she purchased from a garage sale of a property that had been the Parkside Caravan Park in the 1960s. The filling of the Wagga includes the rest of that Parkside blanket. So the Wagga exemplifies the resourcefulness of Australian, bred on a diet of harsh uncertainty from drought, fire, flood, war. And this has nurtured the folk heritage of making something out of nothing. The first half of the 20th century, really kind of regardless of economic circumstances, throughout most of Australia, there was a recognition of practicing thrift through times of deprivation and through times of hardship. So the Wagga, this uniquely Australian creation, embodies this practice. As people made Waggas to keep themselves warm, they also made them as textiles to share and gifts. It's when you start to study them, it's amazing how many of them were made as wedding gifts for other people. Not necessarily for yourself, but you might have used your child's christening gown in a Wagga and then given that to them as a wedding gift. Or you might have used part of their wedding dress or your wedding dress or your father's suit or something like that. And so there's a real kind of intergenerational play with many of these in storytelling as these domestic heirlooms were passed down from generation to generation. So, like so many of the lost arts that were never really lost, I believe, at least, that the Wagga tradition is as strong today as it ever was. That over time, the Wagga tradition has changed and developed and adapted to changing needs. But it has come full circle as a symbol of artistic expression and cultural acknowledgement and environmental awareness. Throughout all of this, it remains a symbol of ingenuity and the make do, use up, or do without philosophy of necessity. So that's a little bit about the Wagga. As mentioned, the National Wool Museum collection, I'd like to talk a little bit about that at the moment. We do have a fairly extensive collection. It is, to our understanding, the largest public collection of Waggas in Australia. There are many other institutions that have Waggas, but ours is the most comprehensive, with examples from the 1890s right through into the present, and including heritage quilts, Expressions the Wool Quilt Prize, which are art quilts, and that is a partnership that we do with with Ozquilt Australia, and a biennial acquisition of contemporary quilt making based in wool, and then 65 blankets. Which brings us to, I'd like to talk a little bit about an ongoing project, and I have some propaganda here to give out to all of you about it, which is the Wagga Project. This is our ongoing passion. We had an exhibition last year, and I'm happy to send out links. By the way, we have a long list of reading materials that's related to the talk that I just gave, and extra resource material on that. If you're interested in it, I can pass that along to you, and then you can pass it along to anyone who's interested. A lot of research has been done on this, but we did an exhibition last year called Necessity, Wagga's the Art of Making Do, and it brought about 25 of our quilts and Waggas out from the collection, pardon me. And we did an exhibition with some objects from the former Gold Museum in terms of how telling the story of the Australian story of making do and using up. Part of that was the Wagga Project. So we want Australians to dig into their trunks, to look under the bed, to look in their closets and find not only heritage quilts and Waggas, but any kinds of quilts that they may have, and share those with themselves, with their family, and with the community. And so that is what the Wagga Project is. Since we launched that last year, we have acquired, believe it or not, 10 new Waggas into the collection in the last year, which may not seem like a whole lot, but for anybody working in the museum world, to acquire 10 objects of one kind within 1 year is pretty extraordinary, particularly something like Waggas and quilts. So the Wagga Project, there are 3 ways you can participate. You can do it as simply and easily as sharing your Wagga or your quilt story with a hashtag on social media, for those of you who are social media savvy. You can add your quilt or Wagga to the National Quilt Register, and I'll talk about that a little bit in a second. Or if you're feeling so generous and wanting to preserve your textile into the future, we are more than happy to speak with you about the possibility of having it donated to the National Wool Museum collection and what is quickly becoming the National Quilt Collection. So the National Quilt Register, for those of you who are quilters, it is Australia's only online resource for quilters. For those of you who are tech savvy and social media savvy, it is an online database. It's also a little bit kind of like Facebook or Instagram for quilts. There are about 4,500 to maybe 5,000 quilts on it right now, running the gamut from early colonial quilts to contemporary art quilts, things that are made today. There's a section as well on animal skins and traditional First Peoples textile making as well. Encourage you to go to nationalquiltregister.com. Take a look. If you need any help on that or want to have any support, happy to speak with you about that as well. My card's also up here in case you want to reach out and get in touch. Yes, so Necessity, the exhibition that we had, also on the National Quilt Register, two little pieces of background information. Dr. Luke Keogh, who was the former senior curator at the National Wool Museum, he's now gone on to teach at Deakin University. He and I co-authored paper on the history of the Wagga quilt, which is a bit like the talk that I just gave, only a little bit deeper and with actual citations. That's on there. There is also a 3D virtual tour of necessity, Waggas and the Art of Making Do, so you can go on and you can actually still experience the exhibition through that. So that's it. That's the most of my talk, and I leave this up there because I want to thank you for offering me the opportunity to come and speak to you, even though I am not my best in terms of talking today. Apologies, I had to read so much and that my throat has been really not its best, but I appreciate your patience with me. And I really want to thank Anthony and your team for allowing me to come and speak